The radio crackled with static, a desperate sound that cut through the heavy humidity of the Afghan night. Inside a shallow, rocky depression, a team of United States Navy SEALs lay pinned down, their bodies pressed flat against the cold earth. The air was thick with the acrid smell of cordite and the finer, more terrifying scent of dust kicked up by near misses. They were 7 men, a skilled and experienced squad, but at that moment, they were also prey. The chatter on the comms was frantic, low, and urgent. Bravo 6, this is Viper. We have no reinforcements. I repeat, no reinforcements can be pushed to your grid. You are on your own. The voice from the forward operating base was clear, but it carried the finality of a death sentence. The team leader, a grizzled senior chief, closed his eyes for a brief second, processing the information. They were deep in a valley system notorious for insurgent activity, an area where the mountains had ears and the caves held countless enemies. Their mission, to extract a high-value intelligence source, had gone sideways the moment they stepped off the insertion path. Now they were surrounded by a highly mobile enemy force that seemed to multiply with every passing minute. The insurgents knew the terrain, used it like an extension of their own bodies, flowing through crevices and over ridges that the Americans couldn't hope to navigate under fire. The situation was a classic ambush. The SEALs had moved into what they thought was a secure rendezvous point, only for the hills on 3 sides to come alive with the angry, staccato rhythm of AK-47s and the deeper thump of rocket-propelled grenades. They had taken cover behind a small, crumbling rock wall, the remnants of an ancient shepherd's enclosure. It offered little protection, but it was all they had. Return fire was steady, but it was a suppressing action, not a winning one. They were buying time they now knew wasn't coming. "We've got movement on the eastern ridge," one of the SEALs, a young petty officer with a dusty face, whispered through gritted teeth. "They're trying to flank us. If they get that position, they'll have a direct line into our cover." The senior chief looked east. The ridge was a jagged spine of rock about 300 meters out. If the enemy set up a machine gun there, the wall they were hiding behind would become a tomb. The SEALs had their own snipers, but in the chaos of the initial attack, their primary designated marksman had taken a piece of shrapnel to his shoulder. He was alive and still firing, but his accuracy was compromised. They needed a miracle. In the command center 100 miles away, the mood was just as tense. Maps were spread across tables, and officers stared at screens showing the blinking icons of friendly forces. The decision to withhold reinforcements was a strategic nightmare. The only available quick reaction force was already committed to protecting a different village from a known major offensive. To pull them would save 7 men, but potentially sacrifice dozens of civilians and another unit. It was a brutal calculus of war, and the 7 men in that valley were the variables being weighed. The senior chief clicked his radio. "Copy that, base. We understand. Viper out." He looked at his men. "All right, you heard him. It's just us. We fight our way out or we die here. Conserve ammo, make every shot count." Just as he finished speaking, a single shot rang out. But it didn't come from the enemy's position on the ridge. It came from a different direction entirely, a steep, nearly vertical cliff face to the west that everyone had assumed was impassable. The sound of the high-caliber round was distinct, a sharp crack that echoed off the rocks. A second later, the insurgent who had been leading the flanking maneuver on the east ridge crumpled, his body tumbling silently down the rocky slope. Another shot, another insurgent, this one the machine gunner setting up his position. The flanking attack halted immediately, the surviving enemy scrambling for cover, confused about the direction of this new threat. The SEALs looked at each other. "Who the hell was that?" the young petty officer asked. The senior chief just shook his head, peering through his binoculars toward the cliff face. He scanned the rocks, looking for a muzzle flash, a glint of glass, anything. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows that made the terrain a patchwork of light and dark. It was perfect sniper country. But he saw nothing. The cliff was a jumble of limestone and shale, a place where a single misstep meant a fatal fall. No one could have gotten a team up there, let alone a spotter and a shooter. It was then he noticed a detail he had missed before. On a small, precarious ledge, almost invisible against the rock, a piece of fabric fluttered. It was part of a burqa, the traditional garment worn by Afghan women. His heart sank for a moment, thinking a civilian was caught in the crossfire. But then he saw the rifle barrel, expertly camouflaged, and the faint wisp of smoke disappearing into the twilight. High above the battlefield, a young woman named Farzana lay on that ledge. She was not a soldier in any conventional army. She was a shepherd's daughter from a village that had been wiped off the map by the Taliban 2 years ago for refusing to harbor weapons. She had survived by hiding in a cave, watching her family and neighbors be executed. Since then, she had lived in the mountains, a ghost moving among the peaks she had known since childhood. She had been watching the American patrol since they landed, knowing they were walking into a trap. She had tried to signal them with a flash of her small mirror, but they were too focused on their objective to see it. When the shooting started, she had climbed. It took her 45 minutes of heart-stopping effort to reach this ledge, a spot she had used before to hunt ibex for food. From here, she had a perfect view of the eastern ridge. She had waited, watching through the scope of an old Russian Dragunov sniper rifle, a weapon she had taken from a dead insurgent months ago. She saw the SEALs fighting bravely, but she also saw the trap closing. When the 2 men on the ridge began to set up their flanking position, she knew the moment had come. She took a deep breath, the same breath she took before firing at a goat, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle kicked against her shoulder, a familiar and comforting feeling. She didn't think of the men she shot as men. In her mind, they were simply predators, wolves that needed to be put down. She had no love for the Americans, but she hated the Taliban more. They had taken everything from her. On this day, they would take nothing more. Down in the depression, the senior chief was the first to understand. "It's a lone shooter," he muttered, the realization dawning on him. "High on the west face. Cover her!" He didn't know who or why, but that shooter was their only hope. The SEALs shifted their focus, laying down suppressing fire on any insurgent who tried to take a shot at the cliff. Farzana, seeing the Americans now providing cover for her, allowed herself a tiny, grim smile. She chambered another round. The dance had begun. For the next 2 hours, a silent partnership was formed. Farzana was the eye in the storm. From her perch, she could see the entire battlefield. She picked off insurgents one by one. When 3 tried to circle around the back of the SEALs using a dry riverbed, she dropped 2 of them before the 3rd even knew he was being targeted. When a sniper on the opposite ridge tried to line up a shot on the senior chief, Farzana found him first, her bullet catching him as he adjusted his scope. The SEALs, for their part, kept the enemy's heads down, giving Farzana the precious seconds she needed to acquire her next target. They communicated with hand signals and short, clipped sentences, a language of war that transcended nationality. The young petty officer looked up at the cliff with a newfound awe. "Whoever she is, she's the best shot I've ever seen," he said. The senior chief just nodded. He had been in countless firefights, but he had never seen anything like this. They were being saved by a ghost. As darkness fell, the insurgents' resolve began to waver. They had lost over a dozen men, and they still couldn't see who was killing them. The morale that had been so high at the beginning of the ambush was gone, replaced by a superstitious fear of the mountain itself. They began to pull back, dragging their wounded with them. The SEALs, sensing the shift, began to move. They formed a tight defensive perimeter and started a slow, methodical retreat toward their extraction point. Farzana covered them the whole way, her scope following their progress, ready to fire at any sign of pursuit. It was only when the SEALs reached the valley floor and the sound of rotors filled the air that she finally allowed herself to relax. The helicopter, a big MH-47 Chinook, swooped in, its miniguns sweeping the ridges for any final threats. The SEALs scrambled aboard, a whirlwind of exhaustion and relief. As the helicopter lifted off, the senior chief looked back at the cliff one last time. He saw a figure stand up on the ledge, silhouetted against the rising moon. It was small, slight. She didn't wave. She just stood there for a moment, a solitary guardian of the peaks, before turning and disappearing back into the shadows from which she came. He knew he would never know her name. He would never be able to thank her. But he would carry the image of that lone figure on the mountain with him for the rest of his life. The helicopter banked sharply and flew into the night, leaving the silent, blood-soaked valley behind. Back at the base, the after-action reports were filed. The official record stated that the team had successfully evaded an ambush with support from an unknown local national. The details were sparse, sanitized for the official record. But among the 7 men, the story was different. For weeks afterward, they spoke about her in hushed tones. They wondered who she was, why she helped them, and if she was still alive. The senior chief, a man of few words, simply said, "We owe her everything." He put in a request for information, trying to identify the woman on the cliff. He used satellite imagery to pinpoint the ledge, hoping to find a village, a family, a clue. The intelligence analysts came back with a name from an old, dusty file, Farzana. They had a photograph, too, a grayscale image from a village census taken years ago. It showed a young girl with serious, intelligent eyes standing next to her father, a man known to the Americans as a peaceful and cooperative village elder. The file noted that the village had been destroyed, the inhabitants presumed dead. The senior chief printed the photo and pinned it to the wall of his bunk. He didn't know if she was the same girl, but he felt a connection. He wrote a letter, not to her, but about her. He wrote about her bravery, her skill, and her selflessness. He sealed it in an envelope and addressed it to the Angel of the Mountains. He kept it in his footlocker, a personal tribute to a debt he could never repay. 2 years later, the war was officially over. The senior chief, now retired, found himself restless in his suburban home. He couldn't shake the memory of that night. He decided to go back, not as a soldier, but as a civilian. It was a dangerous and foolhardy idea, his friends told him, but he had to know. He traveled to Kabul, hired a local fixer who knew the mountains, and together they ventured into the valley. The landscape was the same, harsh and beautiful, but the war had moved on. The villages were slowly being rebuilt. He found the cliff face and, with the help of a local guide, made the treacherous climb to the ledge. It was smaller than he remembered, barely big enough for a person to lie down on. He found shell casings, old and tarnished, and a small piece of dark green fabric snagged on a sharp rock. He picked up a casing, feeling its weight in his palm. The search for her took weeks. They asked in every village, describing the woman they were looking for. Most people just stared blankly or shook their heads. Finally, deep in a remote valley, an old man listened to their story and pointed toward a small stone house built into the side of a hill. The senior chief walked up to the door, his heart pounding. An old woman answered. She was weathered, her face lined with age and hardship, but her eyes were the same as the girl in the photograph. She looked at him, at his Western clothes, and then at the shell casing he was still holding in his hand. A long, silent moment passed between them. She didn't smile, but a flicker of recognition, of shared history, passed over her face. She simply stepped aside and gestured for him to enter. The soldier and the sniper, the hunter and the hunted, finally sat down face to face, the war behind them, the silence between them speaking volumes.